It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. Libya's humanitarian disaster. The number of deaths in the city of Derna rises to more than 11,000. New satellite images show the devastation left behind by Storm Daniel.
What's happened here in eastern Libya is the worst flood disaster in Africa's recorded history, and people are flocking to help from all over the region as well as the country.
Also tonight, the Met Police pays damages to 2 women arrested at a vigil for Sarah Everard. And more trouble for Scotland Yard. 4 officers now face disciplinary action over the strip search of a 15-year-old black schoolgirl. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says he will treat people traffickers like terrorists if he gets into power. And NASA pledges to get to the bottom of what used to be known as UFOs. Also tonight, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30. Hello, good evening. We begin tonight in Libya, where a nation accustomed to political instability is now facing a humanitarian disaster on an unprecedented scale. Following the catastrophic floods caused by Storm Daniel, the number of people known to have died in the city of Derna has soared to 11,300, according to the Libyan Red Crescent. Well, the coastal city of Derna in the northeast of Libya had a population of around 100,000 before this disaster. But look at these satellite pictures from before the storm hit. Compared to today, you can see the scale of the destruction, with floodwater and mud burying parts of the city and washing thousands of people out to sea. In a moment, we'll be live in Libya with our special correspondent, Alex Crawford. But first, our Africa correspondent, Yusra El-Bahir, reports from Benghazi.
What happened here isn't just a natural disaster, it's a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of people lived along Wadi Derna before the flood. This is it now. When the river overflowed beyond its banks, it washed away entire communities. Then the worst-case scenario happened. 2 dams burst and unleashed raging flash floods that ravaged the region. Survivors here have lost everything and everyone. What's happened here in eastern Libya is the worst flood disaster in Africa's recorded history, and people are flocking to help from all over the region as well as the country.
It's a disaster that's gone beyond imagination. We thought it was just floods, water going down, but the mud is the greatest problem. Bodies are buried under piles of mud and debris, 3 or 4 meters high of mud.
Devastation everywhere you turn. This drone footage shows the path the wave of floodwater took from the dams as it collapsed buildings before surging into the sea. Rescue workers are desperately trying to recover and identify those that have died. It's grim and difficult work and could take weeks to recover all the bodies.
The needs are so immense and so huge, and they vary. They stretch from body bags to water, food, medical supplies, shelter, generators, telecommunications, water and electricity networks all have gone down due to the storm. So it's really hard to even assess accurately what has happened, where the needs are, how to coordinate all this effort.
This disaster has been compounded by years of political instability and civil war in Libya.
The 2 dams of the city, they were supposed to be repaired like 2 years ago. There was some water lack in the 2 dams, but like no one said nothing about it. No one did nothing about it.
An international aid effort is underway, but with roads cut and bridges destroyed, it could take days before help reaches the people who need it the most. Yusra El-Bahir, Sky News, Benghazi, Libya.
Well, again, you can see from the satellite images the extent of the destruction in Derna. Here we can see a coastal road before and after it was completely washed out. And this shows a residential area, including a football stadium, about 500 metres from the sea, which has been completely destroyed by the torrent of water. Well, Sky Special correspondent Alex Crawford is travelling to Derna. She joins me now from the city of Al Marj. And for the first time, Alex, we've begun to hear those first-hand accounts of buildings collapsing in front of those watching on rooftops. Terrifying for so many.
Absolutely terrifying, horrifying, and people in Derna particularly are saying that it's the disaster is of biblical proportions. They're using terms like it's apocalyptic. And really, I think, although it's very difficult to estimate and have a particular number of those who are dead or even displaced, because it's so uncoordinated between, not only in the area because of this huge devastation that's been caused, but also because the country is split in two. There's two separate governments with rival militia. It's just not a functioning country or a functioning state, and it's very difficult to coordinate anything, never mind humanitarian help at a disaster of this scale.
And Al Marj, where you are, also suffered flooding, while in Derna, retrieval of bodies now the priority from the mud, but also out at sea. A mammoth task ahead amidst the grief.
I mean, a huge task, and talking to some of those survivors in Derna, as well as the people who have rushed down there to help from Benghazi, from all other parts of the country, they feel that they're very much on their own, first of all, and we've not seen any semblance of international humanitarian aid or help going there. We have seen a long stream of a convoy from the Benghazi football club who were sending aid down there with flags waving. We have heard from the people in Derna of how they are themselves digging out by hand bodies. A group of 4 who I spoke to earlier today said that they were using their hands, on their hands and knees, and they'd already retrieved 8 bodies themselves. So I think there are a number of really tragic cases. Whole families have disappeared, whole blocks, apartments, shops, hospitals, schools have disappeared. Another survivor that I spoke to, who was showing me pictures of what was in front of him and what used to be a bank of buildings, houses, a whole community had just flattened, gone. There was no one there anymore, and they still don't know where all those bodies are, with many of those who have survived thinking that they'll never find those lost relatives. They'll never know exactly what happened to them. The stories that we're getting from that area are truly horrifying, and a lot of anger about how their own governments, their own authorities have not done enough. A lot of them feeling that this stems back to the 2011 fall of Gaddafi, when the country was awash with weapons, started by a NATO-funded war which toppled a dictator, but then had no real structure in place to help this country. And it's just gone through corruption, greed, people smuggling, all sorts of things, mafias operating within this split country, and the people have suffered at the bottom of this terrible, terrible natural disaster compounded by massive human error.
Alex Crawford, live there in northeastern Libya. Thank you. They were 2 ordinary women who wanted to pay their respects at a vigil and light a candle for Sarah Everard, who was murdered by a serving police officer. Instead, Patsy Stevenson and Dania Al-Abaid were handcuffed and arrested on Clapham Common in March 2021. Now, after a 2-year legal battle, the Metropolitan Police has paid damages to them and apologised. Ivor Bennett has more.
It became the defining image of a campaign against heavy-handed policing. Patsy Stevenson pinned down and arrested at a vigil for Sarah Everard, who was kidnapped, raped and murdered by a serving officer of the Met. 2.5 years on, she and Dania Al-Abaid have received payouts from the force. The women recalled their experiences with Sky's Sophie Ridge.
There were other women there that night who faced that assault from police officers. Like myself, I was covered in bruises by the end of it. You know, I know one of the women fractured her wrist, apparently. So there's, do you know what I mean? It was heavy-handed. When I say heavy-handed, I mean aggressively so.
The aggression prompted widespread condemnation after women were bundled to the floor and detained. Lockdown rules were in place at the time to limit mass gatherings, and the official vigil was cancelled. But that afternoon, hundreds still went to Clapham Common in South London to pay their respects, including the Princess of Wales. In settling the women's claims, the Met expressed regret, but that's it.
There was no apology, really. I mean, they said their actions were appropriate that night.
Their actions were appropriate. I mean, it sounds like a typo, doesn't it? It sounds like you think, oh, they must be meaning inappropriate.
Oh, you mean inappropriate? But... No, they still stand by that.
In a statement, the force said, "We tried to achieve a balance that recognised the rights of the public to protest and to express their grief and sadness, while also continuing to enforce the relevant COVID legislation," adding it acted in good faith. Events here were looked at by the independent police watchdog, and it ruled the Met had acted appropriately. And judging by the force's statement, it clearly feels that technically it was in the right. But for the women involved, that's really not the point. After all, many came here because they didn't feel protected by the police. And what happened only made that worse. For Dania, it brought back painful memories as a victim of domestic violence.
Going to this vigil and trying to find my voice and stand with other women and express this grief, and then getting arrested and handled the way we did, it brought me back to that time of being silenced.
But their voices are now louder than ever, and they hope their experience will be a catalyst for change.
We need to keep up the public pressure on the police. They need to absolutely radically reform the entire institution or abolish it, if I'm honest.
The overwhelming emotion for both is relief the legal battle is over, but the effects of their arrest will clearly be very long-lasting. Ivor Bennett, Sky News.
Well, in another case which questions trust in the police, 4 Met officers will face disciplinary action over the strip search of a black 15-year-old schoolgirl in 2020, known as Child Q. After a police watchdog investigation, the Met has admitted they have overused their powers to strip search children. Shaman Freeman-Powell has this report.
Power! Power! Power to the woman! Power to the woman!
A community united in anger and disgust after learning that a 15-year-old girl was strip-searched at school after being wrongly accused of carrying drugs.
Child Q, can you hear us? Child Q, can you hear us?
It's taken almost 3 years, but it seems that the calls for action have been heard. 3 officers now potentially face the sack, and a 4th is also attending a misconduct hearing.
While we welcome the judgment and we're really glad that it's come to this stage, we are concerned that this has taken too long to get to this stage. This is not an isolated incident. This is happening elsewhere in not just Hackney and the rest of the country.
Police say that changes have already been made, and as a result, the number of strip searches has already reduced. But the family of Child Q says until powers are reviewed and laws have been changed, children across the country remain at risk. It's this risk that concerns the Children's Commissioner, who struggles to understand why this practice is in place.
Just imagine how that feels to a young boy or girl, and actually the long-term impact of that. And given that only 50% of the cases proceeded to further action, you've got to ask, is it worth that level of trauma?
This woman experienced this for herself when she was just 14 and says the humiliation still impacts her today.
20 years on from when this happened, I still carry that event with me. I felt like I had no choice but to comply. I was told if I kicked off, male officers would be handling me because there was only 2 females on duty.
Like Child Q, there was no responsible adult present, and the fact she had been raped a few years prior wasn't taken into consideration.
It's barbaric that they're allowed to make children strip on command. I cried the whole time, I cried afterwards, and it made me self-harm afterwards. I felt so dirty, again, like when I was raped. It haunts me to this day, to be honest. What happened to me shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened to Child Q.
The police watchdog wants officers' powers to be reviewed and the safeguarding of minors to be prioritised. But questions remain about whether or not there is ever a good reason to strip under 18s naked, and calls to address its disproportionate use on black and brown children. Shaman Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
One of the Prime Minister's 5 key pledges looks to be on shaky ground tonight as new data shows NHS waiting lists in England have increased to a record level. Almost 7.7 million people are currently waiting for treatment. Well, today's disappointing figures come as health leaders question the impact of £200 million of winter funding announced by the government. Our health correspondent Ashish Joshi has more.
The waiting list for elective care has reached a new record of almost 7.7 million. It means the list has grown every month since the Prime Minister's pledge in January to reduce waiting lists by next year. One of the reasons is because the health service is struggling to increase the number of elective surgeries to pre-pandemic levels. The current pace remains well below targets for the next 2 years. Both NHS leaders and the government have said industrial action is behind the slow progress. There is better news for Rishi Sunak, though. Among long-term waits, the number of people waiting more than 2 years has fallen from 314 down to 277, as they aim to eliminate this number completely. And the median wait for treatment is down to 11.3 weeks, the lowest it's been since December. The Prime Minister says the government's initiatives are working.
We're rolling out 5,000 more beds across the NHS. That's on track. Rolling out 800 more ambulances. That's on track. And we're rolling out virtual wards, which are new innovations that doctors have created that allow patients to be treated at home with technology, getting them home quicker, freeing up capacity in hospitals. All those things are really delivering for patients.
But the big test for these initiatives won't come until the winter. We do know the NHS has recorded its busiest summer with 6.5 million attendances in A&E across June, July and August. And that raises concerns over what it could mean for ambulance handover times in the months ahead. It took ambulances in August an average of almost 32 minutes to respond to Category 2 incidents such as heart attacks and strokes. While that is an improvement on this time last year, it is more than 10 minutes longer than pre-pandemic response times. The government has provided NHS trusts with £200 million to help tackle the coming winter. But industrial action among health workers has so far cost an estimated £1 billion. So there are questions being asked over how much the new funding will make a real difference. And the most disruptive strikes are still likely yet to come. Junior doctors and consultants will stage joint action together for the first time next week.
The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says he will prosecute people traffickers like terrorists if he's elected to power. Speaking on a visit to The Hague, he insisted that closer cooperation with the European Union is essential to stopping the boats. But the government say he risks turning the UK into a dumping ground for unwanted migrants. Here's our deputy political editor, Sam Coates.
How do you stop the boats? More than 23,000 migrants have crossed the Channel so far this year. This is a humanitarian and a political crisis.
There's 58,000 spaces in.
Keir Starmer wants to show he can succeed where the government has not. Meeting officials at Europol with a plan he says can turn the tide.
The government has lost control of our borders, and we can see that with the number of crossings there are across the Channel in small boats. We have to stop that. And I think the only way to stop that is to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade.
A new cross-border police unit to track smugglers and a security agreement with the EU to allow real-time intelligence sharing. Tough language too, a pledge to treat smugglers like terrorists by freezing their assets. And the government's flagship policy of sending failed asylum seekers to Rwanda would be scrapped.
We have officers on the ground in France working in quite close cooperation with French authorities, certainly, and also in other EU member states. So I think at this point, there's a lack of clarity about what's new about this.
The Prime Minister has made stopping the boats a central campaign promise. Now the Starmer plan is a chance to put clear blue water between the parties. The Labour leader wants a deal with the EU to return migrants after they land in the UK. He admits that could mean accepting a quota of asylum seekers in exchange.
I think the mask slipped today. We saw what would happen if there was a Labour government, and that is that they would wave in tens of thousands of illegal migrants from a place of safety in Europe.
For Keir Starmer, this is about more than just policy. On migration, he's moving away from deterrence, which Labour just doesn't think works in the way the Tories do, and towards cooperation, which he hopes will. And it also suggests a more confident leader, prepared to talk about the EU and admit there are unpalatable truths and trade-offs. But there's a risk. Tories want to present Keir Starmer as someone who will open the borders and is too close to the EU. He's giving them the chance, gambling that there are bigger gains to be had from this approach. He'll know soon enough if that was right. Sam Coates, Sky News.
President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has been charged with federal firearms offences, accused of lying about his drug use when he bought a gun in 2018. Well, the indictment followed the collapse of a plea deal back in July that would have averted a criminal trial. His lead lawyer issued a statement calling the charge a grave threat to our system of justice. The European Central Bank has increased interest rates for the 10th time in a row to try to combat inflation. The rate has gone up by 0.25 percentage point to an all-time high of 4% in the 20 countries that use the euro. Officers and staff at Greater Manchester Police have been warned that their details may have been exposed to hackers in a data breach. The photos, names and ranks of 8,000 personnel, including undercover officers, may have been compromised after the IT systems of a contractor commissioned to produce ID cards was targeted in the attack. NASA held a briefing today after a lengthy study into hundreds of reports of unexplained sightings. The US Space Agency says it wants to increase efforts to gather information about what it now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAPs. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports.
My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west.
This is a declassified video from a US Navy fighter jet showing a mysterious object moving at incredible speed. Evidence, surely, of a UFO.
That's not our LNS, though, is it? It's not. That is the LNS, dude. Well, if there's like that thing, it's rotating.
Now, in a major shift in how authorities handle reports of mysterious objects, NASA has concluded such sightings, which it calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, require an explanation.
The top takeaway from the study is that there is a lot more to learn. The NASA independent study team did not find any evidence that UAP have an extraterrestrial origin. But we don't know what these UAP are.
Take this one, filmed from another Navy jet in 2015. NASA's UAP report finds, by accounting for altitude, the speed of the jet filming it, and something called parallax, it's in fact a small balloon-sized object floating in 40-mile-an-hour winds.
Okay. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow, look at that, man. Look at it fly.
The report finds NASA's very involvement in UAP will play a vital role in reducing stigma associated with reporting them. By encouraging pilots and the public to come forward, potentially hazardous objects could be more easily detected. And they're open to looking for aliens too, stating current planned or existing NASA missions can widen their scope to include searching for extraterrestrial techno-signatures.
This is excellent news. It means that we are likely to collect more evidence. And that's what we need in scientific inquiry. The worst we can have is the scientific community ignoring this subject, which is of great interest to the public and also now to government.
Most scientists would rather see NASA's budget dedicated to looking for alien life where it's most likely to exist, around distant stars. But now at least no one can accuse them of hiding evidence of extraterrestrials. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Exciting, isn't it? Now, industrial action by American screenwriters and actors has brought Hollywood to a standstill. But the strike's effects are far-reaching, and the 100,000 people working in the British film industry are now struggling to stay afloat. Our arts and entertainment correspondent, Katie Spencer, reports.
After more than 2 months of seeing how the A-listers do industrial action, You'll find the knock-on effects here. Some of the UK's busiest sound stages now more like ghost towns. The impact of Hollywood writers and actors going toe-to-toe with the studios over AI and repeat residuals unavoidable over here, with more than 2/3 of the total UK film spend coming from the US. Speaking at the Trades Union Congress in Liverpool, Sandy Toksvig urging everyone to understand.
It is in all our interests to put a stop to these unfair practices which are being used by the streaming platforms. If you ever watch TV or movies or listen to podcasts, then you are all in this with us.
Elmore, an experienced production assistant, has struggled to book any jobs.
I've basically gone from 2 years of solid work to on-off work for summer, but in the last 6 weeks, no work. There's just no work to apply for anymore.
Construction specialists Forward have relied on theatre and live events to make up for lost work. Side hustles like providing set storage are a vital revenue stream.
When it goes quiet and people are fighting for less and less work in the marketplace, that's unsettling for everyone. It's absolutely brought the large parts of the industry to a grinding halt, and straight after COVID, that's difficult.
Nearly 30,000 people have signed a petition urging the government to consider a furlough-type programme for those affected. But the government says it has no plans to introduce an income replacement scheme, steering freelancers instead to the help already available to delay payments to HMRC.
I've had people saying to me that they're having to sell their house, they're selling their cars. Our message to the government is that they need to put in place some support mechanisms for when things are tough for the workforce, because otherwise they're going to lose skills that they desperately need.
For British film production, employing around 100,000 people directly and indirectly, it is a dire situation to be in. Stuck in the middle, UK workers desperate for the end credits of this strike to play out. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview tonight, joined by the New Statesman's policy and politics correspondent, Zoe Grunewald, and the chief executive of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. Welcome to both of you. Among the stories we will be discussing, this on the front of the Metro, their headline, 7.7 million wait for an NHS slot. That's the lead story. Back in a minute. Well, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, our top stories. The Libyan Red Crescent says 11,300 people are now confirmed to have died in flooding in the city of Derna. One of the women arrested at a vigil to remember Sarah Everard has told Sky News the Metropolitan Police must radically reform or face being abolished. And the Prime Minister has admitted his promise to cut NHS waiting lists may be broken after the number of people waiting for treatment hit a record high of 7.7 million. Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the Chief Executive of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace, and the New Statesman's policy and politics correspondent, Zoe Grunewald, who are with us from now until midnight. Welcome to both of you. So as ever, to the front pages we start. The Metro has news of NHS waiting lists hitting a record high of 7.7 million. Same story for the Eye. They say the PM has blamed doctor strikes for the government missing their key pledge to cut waiting lists. Starmer criticised by left and right, according to The Guardian, following Labour's announcement on their plans to tackle the small boats crisis. The Daily Telegraph reports that unvaccinated children face being forced to isolate for 21 days as measles cases continue to rise. The final betrayal reads The Mirror. They say HS2 has been hit with fresh turmoil after the government refused to rule out axing the Manchester leg of the project. The Financial Times carries good news for the chip maker ARM, whose initial public offering, IPO, has performed well on America's Nasdaq exchange. And the Daily Star reports that a rogue Russian pilot fired 2 missiles at an RAF jet. Well, quick reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of the papers while you watch us. So let's head straight to our guests then, Zoe and Mark. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with NHS waiting list, shall we, Zoe? 7.7 million people, the Metro tells us, 7.7 million people who may well have had their elective surgery cancelled, their appointments rescheduled, may well be living in pain. It's not a good number.
No, it's not a good number. It's terrible for the public and it's terrible for the Prime Minister and the government. So 1 in 7 people are waiting to start treatment. It only seems to be going up and up. If we remember the start of the year, Sunak said one of his pledges was to cut NHS waiting lists. Unfortunately, like the rest of his pledges, it doesn't seem to be going to plan. What's really difficult about this politically for Sunak is that when you have 1 in 7 people in your population with a chronic health condition waiting for treatment, in pain, and then everybody else who's related to them who can see them suffering, you don't look too kindly on the NHS, you don't look too kindly on the government, and then people start to wonder whether the government is making things better for them, and after 13 years, if they still want to keep this government in, if it's only going to let public services degrade, get worse. So this is really politically difficult for Sunak, added to the list of pledges that aren't going too well, and he's going to have to answer to the British public about why this is and why he hasn't got a grip on it.
Well, some explanations today. For example, strike action. The political argument is in the Eye. Sunak says it's doctors' fault. A suggestion is that there's no way you can get waiting lists down when your medics are off work.
Indeed, as you would imagine, this has been poo-pooed by various of the campaign organisations.
BMA, for example.
And of course, the BMA, the Doctors' Trade Union. But at minimum, it hasn't helped, has it? I mean, the fact is there were, 700,000 cancelled appointments or procedures estimated as a result of the strikes so far. There are more strikes coming down the line. That isn't going to help. Part of the issue here, just as Zoe says, the fact is that obviously these are not just statistics, they're not just political footballs back and forth. These are millions of people who are desperately waiting for their treatment. And yes, a downside of government is you get blamed for everything in every part of the state of the nation. The upside of government is you get to choose your own targets. You set out your own message, and then you have the power to implement them or not. And the problem that the Prime Minister now has is that he chose these targets at the start of the year. He presumably chose them on the basis that they were appealing, but he thought they could be hit. Something like this is always going to be important, but it's particularly important because Downing Street chose to make it one of the tests on which they said they should be judged.
Well, I think the BMA acknowledged that, this has an impact. The strike days has had an impact, but it's the tip of the iceberg compared to the direction of travel. accusing them of the years of austerity, obviously, and indeed the COVID crisis, you know, where people's operations did get cancelled as hospitals filled up with people who had COVID. The question is now how you end the strikes, I suppose. You know, what is on offer and what now is being demanded and how you close the gap, because nobody's talking to each other.
So the BMA were asking for quite a considerable pay rise in the 30%, and there was no movement on that. And they're very, very strident about the fact that doctors haven't had a considerable pay rise for years. We saw nurses come to a pay agreement of, I think it was 6%, if I remember correctly, and doctors are nowhere near that. So the government doesn't have very much room to budge, but also the doctors hold quite a lot of power here. You know, NHS waiting lists are going up. People are very distressed about that, and the BMA aren't moving, and doctors are, I think, reasonably angry about the fact that they haven't seen any reasonable pay rise with inflation over the last few years. As you say, ministers need to get around the table and talk, but eventually, you know, as with the cost of living, there's going to have to be some sort of agreement, and it's which side will budge first. And part of the issue here is that if we simultaneously have the situation that the NHS has more money spent on it than ever before, that it is growing, it continues to grow in its cost, it is generally felt not to have sufficient money, then the idea of a pay settlement and anything like that, where on earth does that come from? Where does it come from? We look around the economy, we look at the cost of living crisis, inflation, economic red flags in various different directions. There's nowhere where that's going to be magically squeezed from.
And the cost of borrowing for government now as well.
The cost of borrowing for government
borrowing is going up for them.
Which has its own knock-on effect, exactly. So I do, you know, I agree the BMA have a lot of power in this situation, but they also have the difficulty that if they have an unfulfillable demand and they're an irresistible force, well, what happens? And patients end up stuck in the middle.
Well, it's not just about pay, though, is it? It is about working conditions. And if you've got the massive backlog after COVID and COVID was bad enough, you know your working conditions are going to be bad, and you've got a retention and recruitment crisis on top. You know, there are incentives for government to pay more and offer more at this point, don't you think, Mark?
Well, the message is clearly that, well, if the message is that you pay something up 20-30% more, then this might be resolved. I think the problem is that just isn't going to happen. And the issue is that this does need... You know, I don't think there's a hugely, you know, cynical agenda on behalf of most doctors about this. There have been some somewhat unsavoury comments from some parts of the BMA, I think, in recent months that have come to light, some officials there. But the fact is, if you need a real solution, patients want a real solution, yeah. It's not going to come just by saying, yeah, totally fine, tick the box, move on. And obviously, one of his other pledges is bring inflation down, so they're not going to hand out billions and billions and billions in pay.
Yeah, and another is stop the boats. But let's talk about Sir Keir Starmer's plans for that, shall we? On front page of The Guardian, which I thought might be more supportive, but says that Starmer's plan has been criticised by both left and right over his plan. So which bits are being picked apart by which side?
So it seemed pretty on brand for Starmer now that he's always being picked apart by the left and the right. He's very much leaning into the sort of centrism of the Labour Party. You've seen a lot of interventions from former Labour Prime Ministers, for example, who have been advising Starmer. And I think the thing that Starmer's trying to pull out here is that he's trying to present an immigration policy that will appeal to Conservative voters as well as Labour voters. Now, the problem with that is, of course, those voters won't always agree on the best approach when it comes to immigration. So what he's tried to do is fudge something a little bit, I think. So the left are angry, or the left of the Labour Party are angry with Starmer for saying that those who disagreed with his proposals were un-British, that they would treat criminals involved in cross-channel people smuggling as terrorists and other parts of his plan, whereas the right are seemingly annoyed that he wants to do a deal with the EU about sending back migrants, because they say that will mean that we have to take some as well, and we're basically reopening relationships with the EU that they think have put to bed. So it's not really a surprise that Starmer is kind of irritating everybody. I think he would say that's a sort of necessary evil to get the job done, because unfortunately immigration is a really sticky political situation. Clearly something has to be done, but we also have to be realistic about it. The migration crisis is only going to get worse. Countries will have to cooperate. You know, we are an island, but we cannot do it alone. And I think there are quite a lot of sensible proposals in there. One of the things I do think that Starmer should have pulled out is safe and legal routes, because currently there aren't safe and legal routes for a lot of people crossing the Channel, and arguably that would stop the boats if people could cross in a safe and legal way. But that's not very politically appetising because it sounds like you want to bring more migrants in, which is a very delicate position.
Yeah, much easier to say, let's treat people smugglers as terrorists. So 2 issues for Starmer. One, about both on cooperation with Europe. One on intelligence, not surprising he was at Europol today. Secondly, about returns, getting more returns. The problem is we only have returns agreements with 6 nations now after Brexit. So how do you return them without offering something back, which is now the accusation that you're going to get 100,000 asylum seekers sent by Europe, and therefore you've got a charter to drop asylum seekers in this country?
100,000 or more, depending on the allocation. And in that particular potential agreement, that isn't a return to what was there before. That was something that we weren't in as part of the EU. The idea of the common asylum policy on an EU level was not something that the UK was part of when it was an EU
Which is
member.
just Schengen, isn't it?
Well, precisely, operates related to that, kind of maps across, as it were. I think there's a really serious question about whether actually, safe and legal routes to cross the Channel or a sharing of asylum seekers who are within the EU ought to be the UK's policy goal when we're talking about people who are in danger from tyranny, from aggression, from war around the world. Is it actually the case that where we should be looking to be compassionate is specifically with people who are currently in, say, France or Czechia or Italy? Or is it the case that if you look back to what, say, the coalition or the Cameron government did on a not big enough scale, but around Syria, which was to say, we're going to go to the region, we're going to go to the camps in the region, find the people in the most need and bring them directly here, rather than have this filtration thing where if you do have just about enough money to be able to get to Europe or to be able to get to a people smuggling gang, actually that is the...
But that's still just chicken feed. It's a tiny bit of policy, isn't it? Bringing 20,000 or whatever as we promised at the time.
And I just said it wasn't enough. I would wish it'd be more.
Well, he also wanted to pay money, so you stayed in locality and you paid neighbouring countries.
But remember, this was Merkel's humanitarian disaster in part, because she said if you can get here, if you can get to Germany, then you're welcome to stay, which helped to create and fuel that market for people smuggling gangs. This question is the real question of who we should prioritise when I'd hope we would all agree that Britain should be a help and a safe haven for people in the world who are in danger. I do not believe there are people in France today who are in danger directly of dictatorship, because France is not a dictatorship. There are people, however, fleeing Syria,
that argument doesn't
fleeing
matter,
Ukraine,
though, does it? Because they're still trying to come to this country illegally, and we cannot get them back to France. So, so it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter that they don't want to stay there for any reason.
I mean, the other part of this, of course, is that there's a major issue kicking off about this question of the common policy and sharing allocations within the European Union itself. And we're seeing countries, including Poland, among others, kicking off in a big way about this. That's going to get worse. I don't think particularly joining a policy which is actually already going to be a subject of dispute among EU members is going to be the right way to go.
Yeah, and just quickly, Daily Telegraph also has it on the front. Braverman attacks Starmer over migrants. Well, we would expect her to, wouldn't we? Suella Braverman saying Sir Keir Starmer would make Britain the dumping ground for EU migrants, which we've already said about this idea of burden sharing, which, to be fair, Sir Keir Starmer said was embarrassing nonsense, didn't he, today?
It would be more shocking if she didn't attack Keir Starmer about this. It is literally her job.
But the end result is what? That anybody has a solution to this or not, Zoe, do you think?
Well, I think obviously Labour are going to put forward a cohesive plan at some point for immigration, and to be honest, we're going to see a lot of wrangling between the two parties over this issue as we come up to the election, because it's so politically contentious and they can get each other into all sorts of holes over it. But ultimately, I don't think either party at the minute is having a really sensible, honest conversation with the British public about the sort of crisis we are going to expect to do with migration and how we're going to deal with that. And quite frankly, neither of them want to talk about it, because there's no way we can do it without international cooperation, of which we seem to have dug ourselves into a hole in over the last 6 years and gone to be an island again. So both parties are sparring and they're sort of arguing over details, but I don't think either of them are currently offering something that really is realistic and sustainable in the long term.
Another election issue. TikTok, Anyway, are the government's plans to end no-fault evictions being kicked into the long grass? Discussing that and other rent measures in a moment.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
It's turning everybody into, a crazy, violent drug addict.
How are you feeling?
I am angry. It is an anti-woman agenda.
2 women say that you paid for their abortions. Are you a hypocrite, sir? Will your candidates win?
I hope so. I think they will. I think they're great candidates.
I gotta be realistic. My sister's dead.
More than 4 weeks on, there's no murder weapon and no suspect. Are you going to catch this killer?
We are doing everything we can.
Ghislaine Maxwell has pleaded not guilty to all 6 charges against her. Mum, how are you feeling today?
Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine, you just don't cross her.
I'm so excited.
Severe nightmares of these people coming in and just taking me in the middle of the night.
I've watched as whole towns were torn apart by natural disaster.
I'm alive and I'm thankful for that, but there are a lot of people who aren't.
It's not the winds people fear most here, it's the water. We take you to the heart of the stories which shape our world. Do you truly believe what you're saying?
A lot of cases that I know are reported from Ukrainian missiles themselves.
Ambassador, with respect, I think that's preposterous. Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview with me once again, Zoe Grunewald and Mark Wallace. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the FT, shall we, Mark? This is Michael Gove's rent reform over no-fault evictions, which they say is being hampered by Tory infighting, specifically those Tories who seem to have properties they let out. Is that the accusation here?
There's an accusation, interestingly here, by a Whitehall source suggesting that the Conservative Whip's office is the least exciting kind of form of a conspiracy that you can imagine. The Conservative Whip's office features some MPs who own and rent out houses. Quite a lot of MPs own and rent out houses, partially a legacy of the second homes expenses thing, partially just people have made a lot of money buying second houses in this country in many years, as we know. And the idea is they are exaggerating to the Prime Minister how much opposition there is on the Tory benches to the idea of ending no-fault eviction. Now, what I think is more interesting than the theory is the effect. What we're seeing is just after the Prime Minister's proposal to change regulations on nutrient neutrality was sunk by the House of Lords, having been introduced by the government. It's a late amendment, so now can't be brought back in the same form. Now we're seeing this being delayed, potentially at risk. And again, the difficulty for the government is the next election is going to be Labour want it to be a change election. Most of the public, according to polling, believe it's time for a change of government. So Labour will say time for a change. That leaves a government saying, well, you've got to be careful about risking what you've got. Look at what we've achieved. Well, people need to feel they have something for that to work, and you need to have a list of achievements. And when we're talking about waiting lists, the boats, talking about, say, inflation, see what happens there, or indeed the housing crisis, if the government's own legislative programme isn't able to get through, it won't have any chance of having an effect in time.
So it's not delivering anything,
we need
is
to,
what you're saying.
You could stand up and say, oh, be careful with Starmer, and Starmer could turn around on election day in the debate and say, well, what have you got to lose?
Yeah. Well, is it difficult to have a no-fault eviction at a time when landlords can't afford their mortgages and therefore rents are going up? So it's sort of, you know, the fact that it's difficult for landlords at the moment maybe is muddying the water here. But anyway, we'll see what happens with that. Meantime, the Mirror and indeed the Guardian on their front page, what is happening with HS2, the high-speed rail line? It was supposed to go all the way up to Leeds, if you remember, wasn't it? Well, that's been long cancelled. Question is now, will it even get to Manchester?
Yeah, so what we're hearing is that the HS2 high-speed rail link is at risk of being cut on its route north of Birmingham. So yes, there's talk that it might not get to Manchester. Listen, this project has had cuts after cuts. It was a huge part of the levelling up agenda. Remember, levelling up was something that Boris Johnson won his mandate on in 2019. It was a big part of his offering to the north and to the Red Wall. And, you know, it's got totally out of control spending-wise. It's now 34.1 billion. There's plenty of opposition to it. But there's also lots of people in the north for who this is symbolic of investment in the north, of how much Westminster and Whitehall care about the north. And being quite frank, even if HS2 did get to Manchester and Birmingham, there's a whole lot of the north that isn't covered by that, which has terrible transport links. So we shouldn't overestimate how much this meant to various parties in the north of England. But still, it doesn't look great, and it doesn't look great for Sunak, who is often criticised now for ditching the levelling up agenda and for not following through with a lot of Boris Johnson's promises.
Yeah, it's one of these stories where the government hasn't confirmed that something might happen, isn't it? It's one of those, there's an alluded to type story at the root of this. But anybody who's doing any building knows, first of all, how much it costs to build anything, and secondly, how much it costs to borrow to build. So the cost of this would be going up exponentially for government right now.
Yes, I'm old enough to remember the dark, distant days of like 11 years ago when people in various different kind of think tanks on the kind of smaller state side of politics said, do you think the budget for this might be understated? It could go up, and were wildly poo-pooed on all sides of politics for being pessimistic. It's gone way, way further than its worst critics said that it might. But the problem is, a lot of that money's been spent now. I agree with you. I'm from just outside Newcastle. HS2 is not going to what I view, therefore, as a large, important part of the north.
Big part of the north, yeah.
Just the actual north. Sorry, going to get lots of angry tweets now. But you know, the fact is that the connectivity within the north of England is also being neglected. You know, the fact is you could put one tube line to go across, you know, one tube line would go right across large conurbations, millions of people being connected up. But that's just not going to happen.
Wasn't it Northern Powerhouse Rail? Is that the one that was supposed to, you know, be helped by all of this, which isn't going that far now? And anyway, yeah, politically very difficult. But if you are, you know, the accountants in charge of 10 and 11, you're sitting there looking at the cost spiral, aren't you? Quick look at another story on the bottom of the front of the Daily Telegraph. Sunak set to delay banning conversion therapy, concerned about how the legislation should be worded.
This is tricky for the government. This is something that they brought in. This is one of their more progressive policies, to ban conversion therapy for LGBT people. It's difficult, and there are tons of issues with it because it's had opposition from religious groups and things like that, because there is a debate over what actually constitutes conversion therapy. But of course, delaying the ban on it is going to cause a big outcry from those on the left of the party and those on the left who are asking what the government is doing to protect LGBT people, because you hear atrocious stories of conversion therapy, how it ruins people's lives. So this isn't going to be great for those. But for those on the right of the party who might be calling for Sunak to delay this, to focus on other issues, they might be happy with that. So we'll see how that plays out in Tory circles, but it might be another row similar to the Gender Recognition Act row that
and
we
the
saw.
trans guidance for schools as well that we're still waiting for. The last story we were going to do, haven't got time. A judge uses jolly useful ChatGPT for rulings, which we'll talk about next time, shall we? This is Lord Justice Burse, who specialises in intellectual property law, said he'd used the text generation tool to summarise an area of law he was familiar with before copying and pasting it into words. I'm not sure that was the way to do it. Anyway, we will see you soon. Thank you very much indeed, Mark and Zoe. Thank you. See you in the 11. Now the weather.